Ladies and gentlemen, if I may distract you from your dessert for just a few minutes, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, who most of you know as our current acting pastor here at Light of Christ. I'm guessing most of you don't know that before he became a minister, he was a professional soldier. Like Colonel Dameron, he was in the Army, and like Colonel Dameron, he was in the business of shooting down airplanes, which gives me the willies every time I talk about it. Ed Moore, Colonel Ed Moore, graduated from West Point. Most of you know about West Point. I think it's a vocational school up in New England somewhere. New York, maybe, somewhere up there. Graduated in 1967 and became an air defender, and he and Susan traveled all over the world, spending a lot of time in Europe and other exotic places. And along the way, Ed learned to speak several languages, and ultimately, when he got out of the service, became a foreign language professor. And along the way, they also managed to raise 6 kids and now have 15 grandchildren, he and Susan. And one great. 15 grandchildren and 1 great grandchild. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Colonel Ed Moore.
Fellow veterans, family members, distinguished guests. It's an honor and a privilege, it really is, to be here with you today, as well as being a great blessing from the Lord. We're here to honor, as you all know, all those who have served in our country's armed forces in times of war and in times of peace, both those among us and those who have passed on into eternity. The sacrifices required of those who serve are accepted by them as our Lord endured the nails of the cross. We do not expect to be understood or even accepted by those who do not love our country and are not willing to sacrifice for her. I found the following story in honor of Veterans Day on the Facebook page of a fellow vet that I have known for over 50 years. And I quote, "A civilian asked his veteran friend, 'Why do you call that stranger a brother when you don't even know who he is?' Fair question. Here was his reply. 'See that uniform he is wearing? He serves in the United States military. That in itself makes us brothers. Don't care where he is from, what color he is, who he voted for, or even who he prays to. He is still my brother because he chose to put himself second and his country first. For all I know, he has walked where I have walked, left sweat where I left sweat, and drops of blood where I did too. And that too makes us brothers. From time to time, he raised his right hand and signed on the dotted line until time no longer exists. He will be forever my brother. Same with the women that served. They will forever be my sisters. They have my back and I have theirs." The civilian friend stated, "Wow, I never looked at it or even thought about it like that. That's awesome. Does every vet feel like you do?" Yes, they do. We are family, first and foremost, forever family. Thank you all for being my family and for being there for your brothers and sisters when they needed you. Anonymous. I took the following oath upon entering active duty on July 1st, 1963, at Trophy Point at the United States Military Academy, overlooking the Hudson River, a moment that marked the attainment of one of 3 major childhood goals and the beginning of a life of service. I, Edward Moore, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. For me, this was the beginning of a new phase in a life to be lived for God and country. My story, and the story of so many others, the story of a Christian and a soldier and a member of a very special family. A band of brothers bound by a common oath. There were many lessons that I learned during my years of service. Here are 3 of them. 1, learn from those more experienced than you. 2, keep going no matter how tough things get, doing what you were trained to do and know to be right. And number 3, never forget that you belong to a great band of brothers and sisters who have put their country first and self second. I was raised in a Christian family. Devotion to God was always an important part of my life. My godfather was an Episcopal priest, the Reverend Dr. A. Edward Saunders, and it was he who baptized me as an infant. He, along with my parents and great aunts, were a major spiritual presence and influence in my life, always encouraging, always teaching me. I attended Sunday school from the age of 5 years through high school, inspired by many teachers. One was a man who owned a successful company, but was giving that up to serve the Lord in the ordained ministry. That spirit of self-sacrifice at once baffled and drew me. I would have occasion to ponder it over the years. In addition to the call to military service, I had 2 other major goals as a child. The first and earliest was an invitation and a call to ministry. This was in large part due to the influence of Dr. Saunders, my godfather, who encouraged me over the years. The attainment of this goal was to develop and mature very slowly over many years. The remaining goal was to learn, use, and teach other languages. More of that later. There were many milestones along the way. One was meeting my future wife, Susan, while I was a cadet and she was a nursing student. Although we came from different denominational backgrounds, we found that we had everything in common, no major disagreements, at least ones we could not resolve. Having a theological discussion may not be most people's idea of a good time on a date, but it was for us. Not that we didn't enjoy movies, concerts, dances, and parties, but we knew pretty well early on that we were made for each other and that an indispensable element in our relationship was our shared faith. By the time graduation and commissioning were upon us, we had worked out most of the important aspects of our wedding and initial plans for our life together. In 1967, the war in Vietnam was a reality which we all accepted. I had volunteered to go as soon as possible after graduation. Susan was going to complete her nurse's training while I was away. The Lord had other plans for us. A few months before my deployment date, we learned that we were to be blessed with a child. I went off to war, while Susan went to live with family to await the birth. When I first saw our daughter, during a brief R&R that's rest and recuperation for the young folks here. In Hawaii, it was just a few days. Our daughter was 3 months old at that point, only 3 months. In Vietnam, I served in a surface-to-air missile battalion. Yes, there were a couple of those there. Stationed at Chu Lai to defend the Marine Air Base. And for those of you, and I know there are a number amongst the audience who know Bishop Dave Benna of the ACNA. Well, while I was on a remote island sitting on a hill with my Hawk platoon, he was flying back and forth every day in an A6 right overhead at very low altitude. But we only discovered this when we had a meeting about 6 years ago, let's say. And we were chatting in a restaurant, and where were you? Where were you during the war? Where were you? Oh my goodness. Talk about God incidents. Although we missed our families, we had the camaraderie of an unparalleled group of soldiers, the most experienced, the best trained NCOs, and highly motivated men available. A trifecta of solid leadership, high morale, and a real-world mission in a hostile environment that kept everybody on their toes 24/7. Not much chance to get complacent or careless. Back home in the late 1960s, it was a different story. Compared to the relative predictability of war and military structure, our country seemed to be falling apart. Draft dodgers, riots, flag burnings, proliferating drug abuse, rampant immorality. And this was not just something out there, but it was something that touched our own families in various and not good ways. My mother-in-law was on her own to earn a living and raise 6 children, younger than my wife, without a husband or father. My mother was in a similar situation. Meanwhile, society, and in particular, the public school system, were becoming less supportive of family values. Many of the churches seemed unable to help folks cope with these societal challenges, judging but not offering God's mercy. Compared to civil society, the military was a haven of stability. Our small family still had each other and God to strengthen us, and we were part of the larger military family, our band of brothers and sisters who supported us both materially and spiritually. In 1971, while at the Air Defense School in Texas, I was expecting another unaccompanied tour at the end of the course. This was an accepted part of serving at that time, similar to the repeated deployments that our service members have experienced since 9/11. In an unexpected call during Christmas recess, my detailer called me and asked the following question, would I like to go to Paris? I said, of course I would, but when? He said, next summer. Well, I was flabbergasted. The foreign language department at the academy needed someone well enough grounded in the French language to complete the normal 2-year master's program in 1 year. I was a guinea pig, according to Colonel Renfro, the department head, and also one of my former professors. This was an opportunity to develop further the knowledge and skills I had learned previously, what I had been trained to do. While I was studying at the University of Paris, the war dragged on. Colonel Gaddafi had seized power in Libya, and NATO headquarters had been moved to Belgium from Paris. However, we found everyone we met in France very friendly to Americans, and even met a lady who was the widow of an American GI who was a fellow West Point graduate. This is while we were camping in Normandy. During this time, we went to a small island off the coast of France in the Atlantic Ocean, where Susan's father, a B-17 co-pilot, had been shot down during World War II. We located former members of the French resistance who told us of seeing the American GIs parachuting out of the stricken aircraft. They helped one of the crew to escape the Germans. The others were taken prisoner, including my father-in-law, who spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp. Returning to West Point, I had a very rewarding tour of duty on the faculty. Among the many excellent students I taught was one especially outstanding cadet who won a Rhodes Scholarship. I was proud of him. It was during this assignment that I received a call to the ministry. But due to the reduction in force, or RIF as they called it, at the end of the war, the Army didn't need any more chaplains. Strike one. I kept on doing what the Army and the Lord were training me to do. After the West Point assignment, I returned to the Field Army in Germany, serving in an improved Hawk battalion with a real-world NATO mission during the height of the Cold War. These were dark days. It seemed the Soviet Union was gaining the upper hand in negotiations over ICBMs, and we were stationed not far from the Fulda Gap. If the balloon went up, there was no assurance our families could be evacuated as the Soviets and their allies poured across the border between East and West Germany. And we, the American forces, advanced to meet them. But we had a strong faith community, which included everyone from chaplains, assistants, to staff officers. The Lord sustained us, and our enemies were held at bay. Once again, I received a call to the ministry, but now I was too old to be an Army chaplain at the advanced age of 30. Strike two. I kept on doing what the Army and the Lord were training me to do. Returning to the States, I was assigned to an intelligence production unit at Fort Bragg, supporting the 18th Airborne Corps with special mission-tailored intelligence products, all produced in-house, by the way. Once again, we were part of a strong faith community among our military brothers and sisters who supported one another. Our next major assignment was to the Kingdom of Morocco, to assist the host country in equipping and training its armed forces. I traveled extensively throughout the country with my Moroccan counterparts to recon suitable sites for joint training exercises between the Moroccan and U.S. forces. All business was conducted in French, as were the joint conferences which I helped to set up and for which I acted as the interpreter. Another strong faith community of military and civilians. Living in a Muslim country was a different experience for us and for our children. They all learned to speak French and made many lifelong friends. We learned much about Muslim culture from our Moroccan employees. Christians were allowed to worship freely, although it was forbidden to evangelize Moroccan citizens who were Muslims. We traveled periodically to Rota Naval Base in Spain for our healthcare needs. Our two youngest children were born there, beginning life with Spanish birth certificates. And finally, 2 days later, American birth certificates and passports obtained from the consulate in Sevilla. That's Seville. Thank you. Imagine a 2-day-old infant with her own official passport. Does anyone know how they posed the photos? See me later if you think you know. Back in the USA, my final assignment was in current intelligence on the Joint Staff. The 80s were a time of heightened terrorist activity, of aircraft hijackings and bombings. Our old nemesis, Colonel Gaddafi, was behind some of the worst. Lots of 24/7 activity was required to support our country's efforts to counter the attacks of our enemies. The Iran-Iraq War, however, came to an inconclusive end. Iranian efforts to threaten oil tankers in the Persian Gulf were countered successfully, and Colonel Gaddafi was taught a lesson. Meanwhile, as the terrorist efforts increased, so did the support from a truly godly church and many strong Christian friends. I received my third call to the ministry during this time. The process of preparation for holy orders would take another 10 years to complete after I retired from the Army at the beginning of 1990. It culminated in my ordination on, are you ready for this? November 11th, 2000.
Oh my goodness.
Veterans Day. It was thank you. It was 19 years ago. It was a Saturday that year. Since then, I have been privileged to serve in several churches in Virginia, mostly in the central region of Virginia, and the most recent being here in Heathsville. So a life to service to God and country, whose seeds were planted in youth, nurtured in family, church, and the armed forces, continues to find its fulfillment in service to God and His people, especially all those who have served their country so faithfully, as well as those who have supported them. Still a Christian, still a soldier, by the grace of God. Amen.
Thank you very much, Colonel Moore.